Story 1. A true horror story. The time I encountered a real vampire. Have you ever experienced something so terrifying that it made you question everything you thought you knew? Something so bizarre, so chilling, that you couldn't shake it from your mind no matter how much time passed. Well, I did. And to this day, I still can't explain it. But what I encountered that night was real. I met a vampire. It sounds impossible, doesn't it? Vampires are creatures of fiction, things we read about in books or watch in movies. But what if I told you that what happened to me was not only real, but that it happened to someone who, at the time, didn't even believe in vampires? Before I continue, I want to hear from you. Do you believe in creatures like vampires? Or are you more of a skeptic? Maybe you've had a strange encounter of your own, something that made you question reality. Comment below and let me know your thoughts. Share your experiences if you have them, or suggest other stories you'd like to hear. But now, let me tell you what happened the night I met the real vampire. It was a regular evening, or at least it started that way. I had just moved to a small town on the outskirts of the city for work, looking for a fresh start after a messy breakup. I didn't know anyone in town, but I quickly became familiar with the quiet streets and the small businesses that dotted the area. The kind of place where nothing really ever seemed to happen. But that night, something did. Something I could never forget. I had just finished my dinner and was on my way back to my apartment. The streets were empty, and the sky was dark, the kind of inky black that only comes with a moonless night. I wasn't far from my place when I noticed a figure standing in the shadows of an alley. It wasn't uncommon to see people walking around late at night, but this person seemed different. They were tall, almost unnaturally so, and they were standing perfectly still, as if waiting for something or someone. I wasn't the type to approach strangers at night, but there was something about this figure that pulled me in. Curiosity, maybe. Or maybe I was just lonely and looking for any kind of connection in a new place. Whatever it was, I found myself walking toward the alley without thinking twice. As I got closer, I could feel my heart rate pick up. The figure didn't move or acknowledge me, but there was something unsettling about them. Something off. The way they stood, so still and quiet, it felt unnatural. I hesitated for a moment, wondering if I should turn around and go back. But it was too late. The figure spoke. "Lost, are you?" The voice was low, smooth, almost melodic. It made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I didn't know why, but I felt both drawn to them and afraid at the same time. "I'm just heading home," I said, trying to sound confident. The figure stepped forward then, out of the shadows, revealing themselves in the dim light of a nearby street lamp. And that's when I saw them properly. A man, tall and thin, with sharp features that looked too perfect to be real. His skin was pale, almost ashen, and his eyes were the strangest part. They were dark. So dark they seemed to absorb all the light around them, like bottomless pits that stared right through me. My stomach turned, but I couldn't look away. It was as if something was pulling me toward him, making me stay rooted to the spot. He smiled at me, but it wasn't a friendly smile. It was cold, calculating, like he knew something I didn't. "Are you afraid?" he asked, his voice smooth and enticing. I wanted to lie, but I couldn't. Something about him made my entire body tense with fear. "Not really," I said, my voice shaky despite my best efforts. He laughed softly, almost mockingly, and took a step closer. I could feel the air around me change, growing colder, heavier. It was as though the entire street had become silent, as if the world had stopped moving. "You should be," he said, his lips curling into a smile that made my blood run cold. Before I could respond, he reached out, his hand moving faster than I thought possible. I stepped back instinctively, but he was too close. His fingers brushed my wrist, and I felt a chill seep into my skin. It wasn't just cold, it was an unnatural cold, like the very essence of death itself. My heart raced as I pulled away from him, but his grip tightened, and suddenly I couldn't move. My vision started to blur, and I felt dizzy, like the ground was shifting beneath me. "Let go of me," I managed to gasp, but the words barely left my mouth before he spoke again. "You don't understand, do you?" he whispered, his voice like velvet. "I'm not what you think I am." And that's when it hit me. The way he looked, the way he spoke, the unnatural coldness that had washed over me. This wasn't a normal man. This wasn't a person at all. It couldn't be. In a flash, I yanked my arm away, breaking free from his grip. I staggered back, my heart pounding in my chest as I tried to make sense of what had just happened. I could barely keep my balance as I turned and ran down the street, away from the alley, away from that thing. I didn't stop until I was safely inside my apartment, locking the door behind me. I leaned against it, gasping for air, my heart still racing. The feeling of his touch lingered on my skin, cold and wrong. And even though I was safe inside, I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still out there, watching me, waiting. I didn't know what I had encountered that night, but one thing was certain. It wasn't human. It wasn't something that could be explained away. What I had seen, what I had felt, was real. And it wasn't the end of the story. What do you think? Do you believe in things like this? Have you ever experienced something that defies explanation? Let me know in the comments below. And if you want to hear more about what happened next, tell me. Stay tuned, because what came after this night was even worse than I could have ever imagined. Story 2. The real ghost of the abandoned hospital, true paranormal encounter. It's late at night, and you're walking through the halls of an abandoned hospital. The air is thick with dust, and the walls are cracked, but something feels off. You hear a door creak open and footsteps echoing down the corridor. But when you turn, no one is there. This is no ordinary ghost story. This is a true encounter with something far more chilling than any fiction could ever create. What happens next? You won't believe it. Hey! Before we dive deeper into the eerie details, drop a comment below sharing your thoughts. Ever had a creepy encounter? Want to hear more spine-tingling tales like this one? Let me know. And don't forget to share this with anyone who loves a good scare. Story begins. It was the middle of a cold October night when we, a small group of curious friends, decided to venture into the infamous abandoned hospital. The place had been deserted for years, its dark history overshadowing the decaying structure. Rumors of paranormal activity had been circulating for as long as I could remember, and it felt like it was finally time to see if the stories were true. We made our way through the cracked gates, the wind howling in the distance, pushing the thick fog that wrapped around the old building. The dim light from our flashlights barely cut through the darkness as we crossed the threshold. The moment we stepped inside, the heavy silence hit us. It was unsettling, the kind of silence that pressed on your ears and made your skin crawl. But we shrugged it off, each of us trying to act brave, like we were in some adventure movie. The first thing we noticed was a smell, stale, musty, and faintly metallic, like old blood lingering in the air. The hospital had been abandoned for decades, but it felt like the place still held on to its past. We walked down a narrow corridor, our steps echoing in the empty halls. The peeling wallpaper and broken windows gave the place an eerie, desolate look. But it was the feeling of being watched that really started to get to me. Every now and then, I'd glance over my shoulder, but I never saw anyone. We kept walking, exploring the empty rooms. Old medical equipment lay scattered on the floor, some rusted and broken beyond recognition, others still in strangely good condition. But there was one room that stood out from the rest, a room at the end of a long, dark hallway. Its door was ajar, creaking as though it had been waiting for us to come closer. We hesitated for a moment, but curiosity pushed us forward. As we stepped inside, we felt an immediate drop in temperature. The air was unnaturally cold, and it sent a chill down my spine. I tried to ignore the growing unease, but something about this room felt different. There was a faded hospital bed in the center, its sheets tattered and torn. The walls were covered in strange symbols, ones I couldn't make sense of. But the most unsettling thing was the old, cracked mirror hanging on the wall. It seemed out of place, far too clean compared to everything else in the room. Suddenly, I heard a noise, It was soft at first, almost like a whisper, but as I focused on it, it grew louder. A voice. A woman's voice, distant and weak, like she was calling for help. My heart skipped a beat. I looked around, but no one was there. I wasn't the only one who heard it. My friends stood frozen, their eyes wide in fear. "Did you hear that?" one of them whispered. We all nodded in disbelief. The voice wasn't coming from anywhere nearby, but it felt so close, so real. It seemed to echo off the walls, reverberating in our heads. The air grew colder still, and I felt a strange pressure on my chest, like I was suffocating. Without thinking, I turned and bolted out of the room, my friends following behind me. We ran down the hall, but the voice kept following us, faint yet persistent. As we reached the end of the corridor, we paused, trying to catch our breath. That's when we saw it. A figure, standing at the far end of the hallway, shrouded in shadows. It was a woman, dressed in a long hospital gown, her hair matted and tangled. Her eyes glowed with an unnatural light, and her face was pale, twisted in pain. I froze, unable to move. My friends were the same, each of us transfixed by her gaze. She took a slow step forward, then another. Her feet didn't touch the ground, they hovered, just inches above the floor. Her mouth opened, but no words came out. Instead, the voice we had heard earlier echoed once more, louder and more desperate than before. "Help me." It was as if the walls themselves were shaking. The air grew thick with tension, and my chest tightened even more. I had never felt anything so terrifying in my life. We couldn't look away. We couldn't even move. It was like we were frozen in place, caught in the grip of something far beyond our understanding. And then, just as suddenly as it had all started, she disappeared. The figure vanished into thin air, leaving us standing in the dark, breathless and shaking. The silence returned, but this time it was heavier, more oppressive. We didn't say a word as we ran for the exit. Our minds raced with questions, but there were no answers. We couldn't explain what we had seen or heard. The only thing we knew for sure was that whatever haunted that hospital wasn't just a ghost. It was something more. To this day, none of us speak about that night. We've all moved on with our lives, but the memory of the woman in the hospital gown lingers. I can still hear her voice sometimes, especially when I'm alone. And though I've never gone back to that place, I can't help but wonder, was she the spirit of someone who had died there, or was she something far worse? Something that had been waiting for us? What do you think? Do you believe in ghosts, or do you think there's a darker, more sinister force at play in places like that abandoned hospital? Let me know in the comments below. I'd love to hear your thoughts, or maybe share your own creepy experiences with me. And don't forget to hit share if you enjoyed the story. There's always more to come. Story 3. My true experience with a haunted doll, creepy encounter. Have you ever brought something into your home, not knowing the darkness it carried with it? I thought I was buying just an old doll, a harmless antique. But what happened next was anything but harmless. It started small, with strange noises at night, but it quickly escalated into something far worse. The doll wasn't just a doll. It had a mind of its own, and it wanted me to know that I wasn't in control anymore. Before I dive deeper, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Ever had a creepy experience with something you didn't expect to be haunted? Drop a comment below and let me know. Or, if you want to hear more eerie stories, tell me what you'd like to hear next. It was one of those quiet, uneventful weekends when I came across the doll. I was browsing through an old flea market, not really looking for anything in particular, just passing the time. The vendors were packing up their booths, but one table caught my eye. A small, weathered wooden table stacked with all sorts of strange, forgotten items, old books, trinkets, and a few dusty toys. Then I saw it. The doll sat at the corner of the table, its porcelain face pale and expressionless. It was an old-fashioned doll, dressed in a faded blue dress with lace trim. Her hair made of real human-like fibers. Her eyes were glassy, fixed on some faraway point. She had an unsettling stillness about her, like she was waiting for something or someone. I couldn't explain why, but I felt drawn to it. The moment I picked her up, a chill ran through my fingers. I looked at the vendor, a wiry man with graying hair and an odd smile. "Is it for sale?" I asked, trying to ignore the uncomfortable feeling crawling up my spine. "Sure is," he replied, his voice low and raspy. "It's been in the family for generations. But, it's a special one. Be careful with her." He chuckled, as though it were some kind of joke, but the unease in his eyes made me think otherwise. I didn't listen to my gut. I handed him a few dollars, feeling strange about the whole exchange, but in the end, I took the doll home. That night, I placed her on a shelf in my living room, near the window where the light would catch her face during the day. It seemed harmless enough at first, just a doll, an antique with a slightly eerie charm. But that's when things began to happen. At first, it was little things. My keys would be missing from the table when I knew I had left them there. The TV remote would be in the wrong spot. A couple of times, I thought I heard soft footsteps behind me, only to turn around and find the room empty. I chalked it up to forgetfulness or nerves, nothing too strange. But as the days passed, things started to escalate. One evening, I was sitting on the couch, scrolling through my phone when I heard it, a faint, almost inaudible tapping sound. At first, I thought it was a pipe or the house settling, but then I realized it was coming from the shelf where I had placed the doll. I got up and looked at her. She was still sitting there, her hands clasped together, her blank eyes staring into the room. I felt a shiver run down my spine. I didn't think much of it until it happened again the next night, and then the night after that. The tapping grew louder, more distinct, as if she was trying to get my attention. But I couldn't bring myself to move her. Something kept telling me to leave her where she was. Then one night, something changed. I woke up in the middle of the night to the sound of something scratching. It wasn't a soft sound. It was sharp, desperate, as if someone was dragging their nails across the floor. My heart raced, and I sat up, trying to make sense of what was happening. The room was pitch dark except for the faint light from the street outside, but in the shadows, I saw it. The doll. She was no longer on the shelf. My breath caught in my throat. I glanced around, looking for any sign of movement, but nothing. The scratching stopped. My pulse thundered in my ears. I reached for my phone and shined the light across the room. My eyes locked onto the doll, now sitting on the floor at the foot of my bed. I swear she hadn't been there when I went to sleep. I picked her up quickly, my hands shaking. My first instinct was to throw her away, but I couldn't. It was like there was something pulling me to keep her. I placed her back on the shelf and tried to go back to sleep, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The next day, I did some research. I found out that the doll had a dark history, one that went back more than a century. It had originally belonged to a young girl who had died under mysterious circumstances in the early 1900s. Her name had been Clara. The story said that Clara's spirit had never left the doll, and anyone who owned it would soon feel the presence of the child who had died with so many unanswered questions. The more I read, the more I began to feel trapped. The tapping sounds continued louder now, and I could swear I heard faint whispers at night, words that I couldn't quite make out. But the worst part, every time I looked at the doll, I could feel her eyes on me, always following me wherever I went. I started to become obsessed with the idea of getting rid of it. I tried everything, burning sage, leaving it outside, even burying it in the backyard. But every time, without fail, the doll would return to its place on the shelf, as if it had never been touched. One night, things took a darker turn. I was sitting in my living room, alone again, when I heard the unmistakable sound of someone breathing, slow and steady, just behind me. My heart nearly stopped, and I turned around, expecting to see someone in the room with me. But there was nothing. The air felt thick, as though something was pressing down on me. And then I saw it. The doll was no longer on the shelf. I turned to the corner of the room where the doll had been, and there she was, standing upright in the center of the floor. Her glassy eyes seemed to glisten, and for the first time, I saw something else in them, a dark, malicious gleam that I hadn't noticed before. It was as if she was daring me to come closer. I tried to move, but I was frozen. My legs wouldn't respond, my breath caught in my throat. And then, before my eyes, the doll's lips parted, and in a voice so soft, so chilling, it was like a whisper from the grave, she spoke. "Leave, or I will stay." I don't know how, but in that moment, I snapped out of the paralysis. I grabbed the doll, my hands trembling, and I ran out of the house. I drove to a nearby lake, heart pounding, and threw it into the water, watching it sink into the depths. That was the last time I saw the doll, or so I thought. Weeks later, I started having strange dreams. In the dreams, the doll was always there, watching, waiting. No matter where I went, she was there, lurking in the shadows. And the whispers returned, louder each time, growing more desperate, more insistent. I can't escape her, and I wonder now if the doll was never meant to leave me. Maybe it's not about where I put her. Maybe it's about something much darker, something that has followed me, always watching, always waiting. Do you think the doll still haunts me? Or did I truly get rid of it? Share your thoughts in the comments, or tell me about your own creepy experiences. Want to hear more? Let me know what you want to hear next. And don't forget to share this story with anyone who loves a good, spine-chilling tale. Story 4. The real story of the woman who vanished into thin air. Horror true story. Imagine you're walking down the street on a quiet evening when you see a woman standing alone in the dark. You don't think much of it until she turns, smiles, and vanishes into thin air right before your eyes. That's exactly what happened to me. But the truth behind her disappearance? It's far darker than I could have ever imagined. What do you think happened to her? Do you think it was a ghost or something worse? Drop a comment below and let me know your thoughts. Or, if you've had your own creepy encounter, share it with me. I'd love to hear your stories. It was an ordinary evening, or at least it started that way. I was walking home from work, the sky fading into twilight, casting long shadows on the empty street. The world seemed quiet, peaceful even, as I made my way through the familiar path that led to my apartment. The air was crisp with a hint of fall, and there was a slight breeze that ruffled the leaves around me. I had a feeling everything was just as it should be until I saw her. She was standing at the corner of the street, just outside the glow of a street lamp. At first, I didn't think much of it. Just another person waiting for a bus, or maybe someone who had gotten lost in thought. But as I walked closer, I began to feel uneasy. There was something about her presence that felt off, even though she hadn't moved. She was tall, dressed in a long, dark coat, and her hair was dark, hanging loosely around her shoulders. Her face was turned away from me, but there was something in her posture, a stillness that seemed unnatural. As I got closer, I found myself slowing down, my steps growing more hesitant. It wasn't that she looked threatening. There was just something wrong with her. It was like my gut was telling me to be cautious, but I couldn't figure out why. As I passed her, she suddenly turned toward me. Her face was pale, almost too pale, and her eyes were wide, dark, and unblinking. She smiled, but it wasn't a friendly smile. It was wide, too wide and unsettling. It was as if she knew something I didn't. I froze. For a moment, I couldn't look away. Her eyes seemed to bore into me, searching for something, maybe answers. Then, without saying a word, she simply vanished. One moment, she was there, standing in front of me, her face still locked in that eerie grin. And the next, she was gone, like she had never existed at all. I stood there, confused, my heart pounding in my chest. I looked around, but there was no trace of her. No footsteps leading away. No shadows shifting in the dark. Nothing. It was like she had just evaporated into the night. I shook my head, telling myself I must have imagined it. Maybe I was tired. Maybe it was the dimming light playing tricks on me. I turned to leave, but something made me stop. I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see her standing there again. But there was nothing, just an empty street, as still as before. I quickly walked the rest of the way home, trying to push the encounter out of my mind. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't forget the feeling. The feeling that I wasn't just seeing a woman, but something far stranger, far more terrifying. Over the next few days, I kept thinking about her. Her pale face, the smile, the way she vanished. It nagged at me, like a puzzle I couldn't solve. I tried to tell myself it was just a strange coincidence, a trick of the mind. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. Then, one evening, a week later, I was walking home again. It had been a long, stressful day, and I was eager to get back to the comfort of my apartment. As I neared the same corner where I had seen her, my heart skipped a beat. There she was again. But this time, it was different. This time, she wasn't standing still. She was walking. At first, I thought it was just another person on the street, someone out for an evening stroll. But then I saw her face, the same pale skin, the same unnerving smile, and the same dark, unblinking eyes. I stopped in my tracks, my blood running cold. She was walking toward me, her pace slow and deliberate, her head tilted slightly, as if she were studying me. The air around her seemed colder, even though the night was warm. And the strangest thing? There was no sound, no footsteps, no rustling of clothes, nothing. I felt my heart race, and I found myself backing away, slowly at first, then faster, until I was nearly running. My mind screamed at me to get away, but my legs felt like they were moving through molasses, weighed down by an invisible force. And then, just like before, she vanished. One moment, she was there, walking toward me, and the next, she was gone. There was no trace of her anywhere, no shadow, no sign that she had even been there. I stood frozen in place, trying to catch my breath. I couldn't explain it. It didn't make sense. She wasn't real, she couldn't be. But then, why did I feel like she was somehow tied to me? Why did I feel like she was watching me? And why, every time I closed my eyes, did I see her smile? I spent the next few days researching. I looked up everything I could find about people vanishing into thin air, ghosts, and strange occurrences. I even asked around, talking to people I trusted, hoping someone might have seen something similar, but no one had. No one had ever seen a woman like that. Then one night, I couldn't take it anymore. I had to know what was happening. I decided to go back to the street corner, hoping to find an explanation or maybe some kind of closure. I wasn't sure what I was looking for, but I needed answers. When I got there, the street was empty, just like the other nights. The streetlights flickered above, casting long shadows on the pavement. I stood there for a while, my heart thumping in my chest, waiting for something to happen. And then I saw her. She was standing in the same spot as before, her dark eyes staring straight at me. But this time, she didn't smile. Instead, her face was expressionless, cold and blank. She didn't move, didn't speak. She just stood there, watching. I took a step forward, unable to help myself. And then, just as I was within arm's reach, she whispered, "Now, it's your turn." I couldn't breathe. The words echoed in my mind, and for a moment, I felt like I was sinking into the ground. The world around me began to spin. I tried to step back, but it was as if the ground was pulling me in. I blinked, and in the next instant, everything went black. When I woke up, I was back at my apartment. My clothes were soaked with sweat, and my body felt heavy, like I had been through something that didn't make sense. I checked my phone, only to see that several hours had passed since I had gone out. I tried to shake it off, thinking maybe it was all just a bad dream, but I knew deep down that it wasn't. The woman wasn't gone. She was still with me, somehow. And it wasn't just her smile that haunted me. It was her words. "Now it's your turn." I didn't know what she meant or why she had chosen me, but I knew one thing for sure. I couldn't escape her. She was real, and she was waiting for me to disappear, just like all the others before me. So, if you see her, if you see that woman standing alone in the dark, don't get too close. Don't even look at her, because once you do, she'll claim you. And trust me, you won't be coming back. Story 5 / The night I was attacked by an invisible force, true paranormal experience. Have you ever experienced something that you couldn't explain? Something so terrifying that you couldn't even see it, but you could feel its presence, its power? I still remember the night I was attacked by an invisible force. It wasn't a dream or my imagination. It was real, and it left me questioning everything I thought I knew about the world. What do you think happened to me? Have you ever had something unexplainable happen to you? Drop a comment below with your thoughts or share your own creepy encounters. Want to hear more stories? Let me know what you'd like to hear next. Asterisk's story begins asterisk. It started like any other night. I was home alone, enjoying the peace and quiet after a long day. The air outside was warm, and the faint sound of cars passing by drifted through my window. My apartment was small but cozy, a place where I always felt safe. But that night, everything changed. I remember sitting on the couch, watching TV, when I felt it, a sudden chill in the air. It wasn't the kind of chill that comes with a draft or the change in temperature. It was a coldness that seemed to fill the room, creeping into my bones. I looked around, but the windows were closed, and there was no reason for the air to feel so off. I shrugged it off, assuming it was just my mind playing tricks on me. But as I turned back to the screen, I noticed something strange. The lights flickered, just for a second. A quick, subtle blink, like a pulse. I thought maybe it was a power surge, but that didn't explain the unease settling in my chest. A few minutes later, the feeling intensified. The room grew colder, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I couldn't shake the sensation that I wasn't alone. It was as though something was watching me, but when I turned around, there was nothing there. I tried to tell myself it was just the dark playing tricks on my mind, but I couldn't deny the growing sense of dread that filled the air. It felt oppressive, like the walls were closing in on me. That's when I heard it, a soft, almost inaudible sound, like a faint scratching noise. I froze, my heart skipping a beat. It was coming from behind me, from the hallway leading to the bedrooms. I stood up, hesitant, and slowly made my way toward the sound. My footsteps felt loud in the silence, my breath shallow with anxiety. As I reached the hallway, I peered into the dark, but saw nothing out of the ordinary. No one was there, just the shadows, stretching long in the dim light. I turned to head back to the living room, but that's when it happened. A sudden force hit me in the back, sending me stumbling forward. It wasn't like a gust of wind or an object falling. It felt like a hand, cold and invisible, had shoved me hard enough to knock the wind out of me. I caught myself against the wall, gasping for air, my heart pounding in my chest. My head was spinning. I didn't know what to think. Was I imagining it? Was there some logical explanation I was missing? But then it happened again. This time, it felt like something was gripping my shoulders, pulling me backward, as though I were being dragged by an invisible hand. My body was weightless for a split second, and then I slammed back into the wall, pain shooting through my spine. I tried to scream, but the words got stuck in my throat. My body was trembling, every muscle on high alert, but I couldn't move. It was like something was holding me in place, keeping me there against my will. I fought against the invisible force, desperate to break free, but it was useless. I could feel the air shift around me, cold and thick, pressing in from all sides. It wasn't just the physical pressure. It was the fear, the overwhelming sense of something dark and malicious closing in on me. My heart raced. My breath came in ragged gasps, and all I could think was that I needed to get out. But no matter how hard I tried to move, I couldn't. My legs wouldn't cooperate. My body refused to respond. The invisible grip was unrelenting, holding me in place as I struggled, helpless. It felt like hours had passed, though I'm sure it was only a few minutes. My head was spinning, and I could feel tears beginning to sting my eyes. The fear was consuming me. I didn't know what was happening or why, but I knew I needed it to stop. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the pressure lifted. The coldness in the room faded, and I was able to move again. My legs buckled beneath me, and I collapsed to the floor, gasping for air. I sat there, frozen, unable to process what had just happened. Was it real? Had I really been attacked by something invisible? Or had my mind simply snapped? I don't know how long I sat there in the dark, trying to make sense of everything. Eventually, I managed to get to my feet, though my body felt weak and unsteady. I knew I couldn't stay in that apartment any longer, not after what I had just experienced. I grabbed my phone, calling a friend to come over. I needed anyone, to be there with me. I couldn't face that house alone again. As I waited, I kept hearing strange noises, scratching, tapping, soft whispers that I couldn't quite make out. I'd check every room, but there was never anyone there. It was like the house itself was alive, haunted by something I couldn't see. When my friend finally arrived, I explained everything, though I'm sure they thought I was overreacting. They didn't understand the terror I had felt, the way it had gripped me so tightly that I couldn't even breathe. But even though they didn't believe me, they stayed the night. The night passed in uneasy silence. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still there, watching me, waiting for the right moment to strike again. But by morning, nothing more happened. The house felt normal again, as if whatever had been haunting it had disappeared for the time being. But that night, I couldn't escape the feeling that I wasn't alone. I started hearing whispers, voices I couldn't understand, and the cold would return in brief flashes, just enough to send a chill down my spine. I didn't know what was going on, but I knew one thing for sure. Something dark was connected to that place. Days turned into weeks, and I couldn't shake the fear. The attacks didn't happen again, but the feeling of being watched, of being followed, never left. I moved out of that apartment as soon as I could, but the unease stayed with me. It felt like the invisible force had attached itself to me, following me wherever I went. I started researching the apartment's history, hoping to find an explanation. And that's when I learned something terrifying. The building was old, dating back to the 1800s. Over the years, there had been reports of strange occurrences. People feeling watched, hearing voices, and even physical attacks from unseen forces. One person had claimed to have been shoved by an invisible hand, just like I had. The more I read, the more I realized that I wasn't the first to experience this. Whatever had been in that apartment hadn't just been passing through. It had been there for years, maybe even decades, feeding on the fear of those who lived there. I don't know why it targeted me. Maybe I was just in the wrong place at the wrong time. But I'll never forget that night. The night I was attacked by an invisible force that left me questioning everything I thought I knew about the world.